Live from Chicago, it's Art with Anderson, the show that talks, teaches, and tackles all things art. Here's your host, Joe Anderson.
Hey there, it's Art with Anderson, your host, Joe Anderson here with a quick Mother's Day kind of inspiration project. This won't take very long. You can develop this as much as you want, but I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of the themes I talked about in my last episode, which was starting off with more of an improv approach to get over creative block. Now, you've probably seen me draw and do some watercolors of some pretty detailed flowers where I was working from a photograph. This is going to be totally different than that, but we're going to try to practice some techniques that hopefully will unlock that flow state we talked about in our last episode, about trying to just get over that pressure we put on ourselves to create something new. So let's take a look at this picture next to me here. This is a bouquet, or an abstract version of a bouquet that I came up with. And I'm using what's called a Pointillism technique, or if it's in black and white, it's typically called stipple. And it can be used as a shading technique, but it's also taking advantage of some really unique optical information. And that is kind of that when two colors are side by side, especially when they're two very small things, that they can actually mix together in our brain. There's some really unique properties, especially when you place opposite colors next to each other. They almost vibrate and create an even more intense color. So that's what we're going to be looking for, but we're also going to be working without outlines in this one. You can certainly try to use it if you find that it's a little bit too confusing, but without much ado, I'm going to get started here. So with my setup here, I just want to talk to you guys a little bit about my materials today. I usually, for that picture you're seeing at the beginning there, I used some Prismacolor markers, which are really nice. The only issue is if you were to draw something like this and you left it in the sun, it would actually fade over time. So you want to be careful whenever you're working with ink to keep that stuff out of the sun, just like watercolor. But I'm using these Papermate flare markers. They're very much like pens, so they actually are really versatile, and they're actually a pleasure to write with. But so I'm borrowing these. But the thing is that any type of marker, colored pencil will do. The reason I suggest using some sort of marker is just so you don't have to press so hard to make the dots that we're going to be using in this composition. So let's start off with some basics. And really what I want to just point out is we're going to be focusing on, how do you create stipple with any type of color. So let's talk about what the basics are in black and white. Now the thing is, I'm going to practice by pressing down. It takes a little bit of practice to create kind of dotted lines here, trying to get even spacing. Now if you continue with this technique, it might look from this distance like just a bunch of dots. But if you pull that away from your eye a little bit and give it some distance, you might see that it blends together in an almost shaded form. So we start to connect the edges, especially with something like black, we're going to see that. Now another thing that we talked about is these are evenly distributed, so there's a lot of white mixing in there. You could think of these as pixels. Like if you're watching on a screen right now, each square inch is filled with hundreds of little lights that change color, and that's essentially what we're doing. And this was, developed, during the post-impressionism period of exploring some of these ideas that were later then applied to making screens that you're watching on right now. So let's say I wanted to do some shading. Well, I already have this beautiful, well-distributed shape, but if I go back in here and I start layering in more dots or putting them closer together, it's going to have the effect of almost shading, so creating a darker value. So you can start to see that this side appears darker than this one. I can even add more, and I'm now using kind of a random assignment of dots. Now the issue is if you start connecting or stacking the dots, it starts to look a little bit more like little lines. So sometimes putting spaces in between them is going to help you. Now we're just doing this with black and white, and this is creating the illusion of value, right? Like shading, light versus dark. So that's the basic principle. See how this is starting to get much darker? And obviously you could go to a point where, let's try to just do this side. You know, it seems pretty tedious, especially if you have to fill it in all the way to black. We're starting to get a much darker mix just on this side. So you can see that that almost looks like it's shaded over here. Now we're going to be experimenting with different colors, and that's what we're going to try to use in this technique here. So what I want you to do is review your opposite colors. So what I'm going to focus on are my opposites first. My favorite, blue and orange, if you're in Illini or saw any of those demos, that's a great set of opposites. We have yellow and violet or purple, right? And then we also have green and red. Those are opposite colors. And when we think about markers, it can be very difficult to think of them in terms of mixing, right? Because it's not like a paintbrush where you're mixing those things over. And sometimes when you think of layering over those colors, they can get a little muddy. They don't always mix right. Or you just have to find the perfect color. So what's going to be unique is, let's say with this dark blue, you could create like almost a version of light blue if I think of the white as something that I'm mixing with. So if I create that same set of patterns, this is going to start to appear blue if you give it a little bit of a push here. So obviously this isn't, you know, the flower stage yet. I just want to give you this example. Now these are more blue. It's probably hard to see in this small area here. But what I'm going to try to do is outline with orange here. Let's see if we can get those to really pop out. So when those are next to each other, now this orange is really vibrating and giving us a lot more flavor to that. So these two are going to be a really nice, especially when they're opposite each other, they can be a really great way to blend those things together. And let's try some other mixtures here. Let's try yellow. I'll just do, you might not even be able to see too much of this. You know, and we're just using dots here. You certainly can use different types of shapes. You could also use, you know, little lines. So we have that yellow here. Let's try some violet or purple next to it. So even though I'm not creating any lines per se, you can create the illusion very quickly of lines and shading. And that's what we're going to take advantage of to make our flowers today. Now you could think of making all these dots as really annoying or really soothing, depending on how you kind of process these things. But what's really cool is there's this almost electric feeling around these dots that your brain is forced to actually imagine all those colors mixing, and that's what's really powerful about this. Now we've done some opposite colors here, and I want to just see though, let's say I want to make this more of an orange. We could do some shading with this area. I'm going to take now some red. So we start off, this was yellow. I'm taking red now. Let's see if we can create the illusion of orange on this one side. So I'm being careful to kind of place these dots in the white spaces in between the yellow. Let's see if we can get that to appear. It's starting to give us something, but it's definitely starting to push more towards orange. So what are our ingredients really? It's not only the pure color, but it's actually the white of the background that's mixing in, giving that space. So think of your paper as the white paint, and these colors and the space in between them as the opportunity for your eye to do this. And so if this is kind of like hard to look at in some ways, but also satisfying, it's because our brain is busy trying to connect these dots into something that's, makes sense. So how does this relate to what we were exploring last week? Well, the thing was, last week we certainly started to mess with some ideas about just improv, making some marks to respond to. So as much as I mentioned that we would kind of avoid putting an outline in here, if you have a pencil nearby, one of the things we can do to set this up to make it a little bit more of a focused exercise, if you're working with really fine tipped markers, it's easier to work smaller, right? If you have bigger markers, work a little bit bigger. What I'm going to do is kind of create the shape of the vase with just two vertical lines here, drawing them pretty light. And I'm just going to put what looks like a parentheses down here. So it's just a curve. Okay. Now let's try to make a shape that looks a little bit more like it almost looks like one of those old milk cans. I'm going to put that same parentheses shape here and in between, maybe even round this out. Okay, so that's going to be the container for the flowers. And then I'm just going to put a dotted line just around here. This is going to be the area for our bouquet. I don't know exactly where that's going to go. I don't even know if you guys can see that because it's a little bit harder to see on camera. All right, so let's start with something fun like this. Now, whenever we were to shade a round object, we want to think of where the light is coming from. So I'm picturing this as kind of like a blue, kind of, it's not even see-through. It's just, it's kind of like a tin or metal container. So I'm going to imagine that our light, I'll just draw it over here. Our light is kind of coming over. It's slightly in front, and it's lighting up about this half. So this is pretty light. That's pretty light. And then this line is going to go outward. So we're just creating a line where we're going to do, this side is going to be in shadow. This side is going to be in light. So since I want this to be blue, I'm going to start off with this light blue that I have. And I'm just going to start by putting some dots in there. You can certainly do the outline first, but I'm not going to go too crazy. And you certainly can go with a lot more speed if you want, but I'm trying to keep them relatively close together. If you want to do more line work, you can, but I really love getting to do something like this, which is leaving a stripe of white in there. That's going to be our highlight. So if I put the dots closer together as they kind of near that shadow line, they're going to appear darker. I'm trying to follow the path of this object. And this is definitely more of the organized part of this thing. We're also going to follow that same path as it kind of bends across here. Okay, that's my first step. It's hard to really see much going on, but once we go back in with this darker blue, this is going to be our shadow side. And I do basically the same thing here. Now, what's interesting, at this part of the shadow is kind of the darkest. But I'm not going to go too crazy because I'm going to add that light blue back in a little bit later. So notice I'm kind of going on this angle here. I'm going straight down. And I want you to experiment with your color combos. Maybe it's, oh, this is too boring, or you want to mix it up. Let's say you don't have two types of blue. What you could do is just double the amount of dots in that area to make it darker. But this is a very subtle technique, but I've had, like, as much as I would think doing something like this would be kind of painstaking and annoying, I never thought I'd be doing puzzles. Like our family just did like 1,000-piece puzzle, and it was on the table. And I feel like I spent so much time just randomly, I would look and find one piece, and then an hour and a half later, I'd still be working on it. So it was like equal parts satisfying, and then half of it was just frustrating. So you can start to see that we're shaping up this form here, and by kind of changing the direction and deciding where to place these dots, we're literally creating almost like a pixelated image that is then going to be our flower bouquet. I am going to really rush in here maybe to add a little bit more of this blue in here. I want this to be nice and kind of like dark and really show that edge. As it transitions. So see how this is darker and then it goes to that light point. And then I'm going to put some of it into here. So it's definitely all seeming to come from this kind of blue. If your dots are touching, don't worry about it. This is more about the technique and exploring that than anything else. Now, if you get to this point where you want it to be dark, don't hesitate to use some line work maybe. You know, instead of all dots, maybe it's a dotted line. Don't have to be a stickler about this. Remember, this is all about you getting to explore. Definitely gonna just outline this shape a little bit. But this is a really great way to experiment with this pointillism technique. And it'll make you also appreciate any of the artists that worked with this technique, especially George Seurat. We've kind of talked about that painting in the past. I think it's called Sunday on La Grande Jatte. It's a very famous pointillism piece. It's actually located here in Chicago in the Art Institute. So we have this basic form here, and this was probably the most organized part. You can certainly add, you know, a line at the bottom to really make that kind of pop out. And let's add a few more dots here for this blue area. But we have this kind of highlight area and a shadow area that really shows us the turn that this bottle takes. And you can mess with that all day. But all right, now on to the fun part. We're going to start off by doing some scribble flowers up at the top. Now I'm going to do the stems and any of the leaves last, okay? But what I want to do first is pick the color of my flowers, okay? So for this bouquet, I want to have these red flowers in there, okay? And what I'm going to do is pick a few areas kind of in the center, and I'm just going to kind of maybe do more of like a spiral shape. And I just want to, they almost look like an oval, and I just want them to be kind of chaotic. I don't know what they look like just yet, but I'm adding kind of this flower shape. Think of like a rose or a tulip. But the beauty of it is you're not thinking in terms of an outline. You're really just thinking in terms of these masses of color. And believe it or not, you're going to get a better understanding of how color works when you try this, because you're not allowed to just mix a bunch of paint and end up with mud. You kind of retain, as long as you're not laying color over color, you retain the vibrance of each color. Now the trick for the flowers on the side here is don't make them so much of an oval, almost give them this kind of scooped shape. And if it gets a little scribbly, that's okay. Remember, you can always go wild with it later. Think of these flowers because they're turning outward. You know, this is now, you're almost looking at it, so it's shooting outward, so you're seeing a different type of shape. And as dark as these may seem right now, we also just know that there's plenty of white space in between to do all sorts of really cool mixing that's going on. All right, so we have a couple of these major flowers in here. I'm going to put one, and I'm going to make it a little bit larger because I want it to seem like it's kind of coming at us. Kind of doing that spiral technique, and it's coming right up against that flower tin. So you can start to see that these flowers are spaced out, but it's also creating, by the shape of those flowers, is creating a little bit more of a ball shape. And that's why it's helpful to kind of sketch out an outline. All right. Now that we have those planned out, what we're going to do is pick a set of smaller flowers. I think maybe doing like, I kind of want to do purple. So some smaller purple flowers maybe. So what I'm going to do is kind of come up with a smaller grouping of flowers, but I'm going to put them in clumps of like 2 or 3. So here's a small, I'm going to do 3 of them here. I'll do 3 over here. Again, these are just kind of constellations of dots, and you got to let your brain do all the work after you draw it in there. But the key is to keep those white spaces in there, in between each dot, but then also we're working from our most important parts, and then we're going to go into the background, and you're going to see how that will play an important role. Maybe we create some overlap, like this one is kind of in the way. So the red one, there's clearly one set of these 3 flowers behind. Maybe there's one on the far side that we can't see, so there's 2 in that group. Same thing here. So when I say scribble, again, you can certainly use different shapes like this. We're going to get into that scribble motion in a little bit, because we've been sticking with dots here. And that's what's interesting, is if you wait to use any lines, like if you look at the picture here, I'll pop it back up for you. If you look at this picture over here, you're going to notice that it has some line work in there to suggest the little branches, and then the blue is actually kind of a shadow, so it creates some depth there. So I'm looking forward to getting into that. All right, so with this purple, I'm going to put this aside. All right, and what I'm going to do before, I feel like this still needs a little bit of an accent. I think I'm going to stick with this, since this pink color is kind of cool. Maybe we'll save that for last. Let's see if we can do this magenta. I'm going to test it out over here. How dark is it? Looks pretty cool. So what I'm going to do is maybe just, I don't know, a small one of this magenta. We have a smaller grouping over here. Looks pretty similar to the red, I'll be honest. But we'll fill in some of those gaps. We're creating a pattern here, really. But we have a variation in size. And you know what's interesting about groupings? Typically, groupings of 3 are seen as kind of pleasing to the eye. So you can kind of cheat and use some of those things that we know are naturally attractive. Notice how I haven't put any green in there. Let's hold off on that. But we are going to be using some greens and blues in here to really help these things pop out. But I am going to start off by adding some leaves. I'm going to use this light green, and I'm just going to suggest them. And the way that I'm going to do that is just kind of use the lines to kind of create those patterns, just so I have a space for them. So I'm going to just focus on them around the big red flowers. I'm being careful to keep these dotty. You know, they kind of have a sweeping effect. And maybe they kind of come underneath here. Let's, like, since I can see the side of this flower, I'm going to just experiment. Can you kind of see that thing that's holding the flowers together? Now this is what's interesting, and we're going to start getting into this now, is the edge that we see around the flower is going to be created not by an outline, but how dark the color is behind it. Now I'm keeping these leaves are going to be light, but you're going to start to see that some of these pieces are going to look a little bit more intense as we add them. Now what's interesting though is green and red are opposite colors, so they actually have a lot of power when standing next to each other. So those are going to really pop out, especially with the red. But you might notice that it's almost like you can hardly tell what that color is. We'll get back to that and really come up with some ways to make that even more intense. Now we're going to be moving on here, and there's another concept we haven't really talked about too much, but it's a general rule. It's not always the case, but you know, if you're a beginning painter working with color, you can always count on most shadows are going to be cool colors. So that's blue or purple. And since we've started to use purple in this area, we're going to be going to blue as our shadow inside. Now it might be odd to think of, you know, oh, well, leaves and those stems are probably going to be green. Well, what we're going to do is start to put some structure into this drawing with some blue. And we're going to pick some areas. I'm going to show you again on my drawing here. You can see that there's a lot of blue that surrounds some of those yellower clumps that really pop out those forms. So we've spent a lot of time, you know, putting these flowers in place. So we're going to be starting to help those pop out by adding a little bit of blue behind them. So creating some edges. But what I want you to do is just kind of darken it up in areas along the edge. So we're creating almost like they're coming out in the way that stems of the flowers would. So they're going outward as if they imagine go up here. So I'm really going to focus on getting some dark stuff down here. You don't have to get really crazy with it just yet, but trying not to get carried away or accidentally covering up. We're just trying to get right up to the edge on certain things. So the bright flowers that we do have start to really pop out. This outward movement, you know, should kind of twirl down a little bit more as those things kind of come out. Doesn't have to fill in every single spot because we want to still put some light green stuff in there. But again, these blue areas are going to be the base of what our shadows are going to become. So they can really help us later on. So you can start to see there's something going on here. But since none of those dots are really touching each other, that's really where that vibration and that color comes through. I'm going to put a little bit of stuff right here. And just like we did last week, we're focusing on getting like all of these things to work with each other. So what's interesting to me, and I don't know if you can catch this, but inside of this area of these roses, they're starting to take on a little bit more yellow, almost in the white space. Now what's interesting about that is it's what our eyes do, is they kind of combine those things and they are informed by some of the color that's around them. So that's really interesting that that's occurring. And those are the types of things as an artist you really want to pay attention to. now that we put some blue in the shadows, why don't we play up some of that orange? So what I'm going to do is any of the red flowers, I'm just going to put a spiral of these orange dots inside of those red flowers. Now we're not turning them orange, we're kind of infusing them with that. So it's red combined. So we're certainly getting, and this is where you can start scribbling a little bit, getting a little bit more line work. You're just hinting at these colors inside. So maybe it does look a little bit more like a spiral itself. But there's a certain electricity. Now that there's some blue there, these are starting to pop out even more. So if you're thinking about, when you're trying to draw, let's say you had to draw a single light bulb in a darkened room. Well, the thing is that your paint doesn't glow in the dark. It doesn't produce its own light. So how do you create the illusion of glowing? Well, it's actually done with the idea of contrast. Contrast is the relationship between light and dark. So without super dark paint, you wouldn't be able to make something look light by contrast, or, because there's no edges, there's nothing to make it look bright. So that's what we're doing with colors. There's color contrasts that work together. All right, so let's start going back in with this green. Let's start building out some of those stems. I'm focusing on the bottom here, but this is when I'm adding a few just dashes. They're not connected, but they're just directional strokes that kind of just show us where this bouquet is going. It's giving it a form. Some of them can be dots, but I don't want to connect anything. But if you put a line where it ends up in front of one of those things or up to the edge, that's going to help you out a lot. So this is where that scribbling comes in, giving a little bit more of movement. It doesn't always have to be just a dot. And if you see these big white areas here, that's where you want to kind of start putting in some of these areas of chaos, and think of it as darkening the areas around those bright flowers. You want them to stand out. Part of the reason we think of these flowers as so vibrant is because they're oftentimes layered against a green background. So if you have a red flower and that stands against kind of a dark green background of its leaves and stuff, you're going to be seeing that at a heightened level. Alec can't wait for the scribbles, so I'm going to get some more in there just for you, Alec. By the way, I always appreciate your comments and questions, so if you ever have a question or something you want to share. So see how I'm scribbling in here? I'm just suggesting those leaves. It's not even about anything else anymore. We have our flowers and we're kind of protecting them from this dark stuff. We actually use that up against the edge to really start getting that stuff to glow and pop out. Try not to outline, but if you have to, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just you want these, it's more about getting the color to really pop. So down here, we're really starting to work that stuff in. All right. So the green by itself is really not my favorite right now. So I'm going to actually throw in some yellow just around some of those stems. Now that mix in those white areas, now that it's kind of dark, is going to give the illusion of some more light green stuff going on. And especially next to the purple flowers, I'm going to try to add a little bit more of that. Since I have a light green, I'm going to try that as well. Just throwing it in. This is kind of a more orangish one, so I'm not going to go too crazy with it. So I'm taking my light green, and I'm going to certainly start thinking about, okay, these are the scribbles I was talking about. You're getting this kind of jazzy feel, but I'm focusing on this light green is going to try to go closest to those purple flowers. Why? Well, light green is close to yellow, and yellow is the opposite color of purple. And so by filling in some of these areas with the light green and that scribble, we're starting to almost give that purple some gas, like from that green, that yellowish green. So I'm really trying to bring that out and fill in some of the dark areas. And if you start to feel like your scribbles are taking over, try to keep them to just the background. We want to focus on making these color pockets pop out. So I'm using a scribbling stroke just to give the sensation, almost like a, maybe have a little bit kind of peeking off here, right? There's some of the stuff sticks out, but that light green is something that's going to bring that stuff to life. Notice we're losing a little bit of the purple in there. It's definitely looking a little bit too bright. And so we're going to look to create some more contrast in those purples and in those flowers. So, because if you think about a flower, it's layered, and on the inside there's some shadows where each of the petals come together. So I'm going to be using, inside of the red flowers, I'm going to really start to focus on creating towards the center just some dots, some kind of spiral-ish lines with this darker magenta. You could use a blue if you really needed to. But pick, one area kind of like this where, especially if the flower is facing you, that you're really pushing some of those dark areas in. Towards the center of the flower, you're going to get that, and then on the outside. But if you have never painted a flower before, no worries. We're just responding to what we see, right? These flowers don't have to exist in real life. Now, before, we were really focusing on letting the white of the paper show through, and really focusing on leaving no space between those. Now, if you want to darken up the background even more, you can start to throw some red over the top of that green in some cases. And since it's opposite, it's going to push it back even farther. That way you don't have to use the black. Okay. So anywhere that you've preserved that is white, over the purple, I'm adding some of this magenta as well. Magenta is kind of in between purple and red. It's also used in computer printers quite a bit. So this is what I'm talking about. You're scribbling in these shapes. And why do scribbles work when you're drawing nature? It's because it's actually by creating chaotic shapes that you're more likely to think of it as nature. If you start making really predictive strokes that are really straight, you're going to start seeing some odd shapes in there. I'm going to, believe it or not, I'm going to try some blue here. I'm going to just put a little bit inside of these little rows, or I don't know what this is. Just putting a little bit in there instead of like black. You can see that thing is starting to pop a little bit more. I feel like I'm even getting, too intense with this piece. But don't be afraid to go back in with those dots, some of those shadow areas. If you get too into the lines, those are going to take over. And like I said, the two key things I want you to focus on is think of like how these flowers come out. They're grouped in the center and they go outward like this. The ones coming towards you are bending down this way. So part of it would probably be blocked by this flower bending down. Now I'm going to just take a break from this real quick and let's start thinking about, okay, if there's a shadow on this thing, it can be helpful to do a little bit of an outline sketch. And how would you draw an outline with something like these markers? Well, I want to imagine where the back edge of this thing is, about right here. Just going to put two lines out like this, and just a little bit of this kind of like open up shape. We're going to try to create a shadow over here. I don't know if you can see it. I'll make it a little darker for you. Okay, so there's definitely going to be a shadow over here. Believe it or not, I'm going to use this light blue because it's kind of, it's just kind of the lightest one I have. Now the shadow is going to start off dark, okay, when it's close here, and it's going to get a little lighter as it goes out. So I'm going to actually try to move outward this way. So I'm putting the things close together here, and then they're going to space out as they move together. So we're creating a gradient. So see how they're placing closer together when they're close, and then they gradually spread out. So we have the shadow here. Now let's put a few more that are close. Kind of working in a curve here. Just getting it, right behind there is definitely going to be the darkest spot. You can start to see that shadow effect taking hold. I don't even know if I'm going to fill in too much of it here, but maybe a few dots here and there. But I don't want to get too crazy because by that point it looks like it would be a little bit too spaced out for me to really even see anything. But you can really emphasize this, maybe even go in with that darker blue for a little bit and just give this part of the shadow some real emphasis. So maybe right along the edge there. But just be careful to make sure it gets a little bit brighter as it goes out. Now you'd think that something like this would take longer, right? But it looks like we're, just about at our normal length here. But what we've done is taken an abstract concept of not really color mixing in the same way you might mix paint, but actually mixing on the paper with the white of the paper by allowing some space in between. So that optical mixing done by your brain actually creates an opportunity for some really interesting combinations that allow each piece to look different to each person depending on how their eyes are sensitized and what types of, if you're colorblind or more sensitive to a certain color or a combination. You can certainly leverage that as an artist. And if you think about art as something that is kind of a beauty is in the eye of the beholder, this technique will certainly leverage that fact, and anyone who looks at your work will certainly start to see some things you may not have even seen, and that's the beauty of it. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this. If you tried it out, or you apply it to an even different thing, or if you get even crazier with the scribbles, I'd love to see the result. I'll be honest and say that, a lot of these were a little bit more controlled than, even my first one. And you could do that, I think, a little bit better with some thicker markers. So experiment with your materials. Maybe you could even do something like I don't know. You could do anything with this technique, but I'd love to see what you guys do and how you interpret that space. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this one. See, I can't even stop doing it. I'm just kind of addicted. Sorry. But if you've joined in for the whole time, I really appreciate you guys joining in. This would make a great gift for a loved one or your mother on Mother's Day, especially if you can't be there to spend some time. And again, I'd love to see your results, but otherwise I hope they bring joy to you as you make them and whoever you decide to share it with. I want to thank Alec, Joe, and Kate. Thank you for joining in today. And then I want to encourage you guys to check out the channel on Saturday at 3:30. We're going to be hosting a designer, artist, kind of videographer, Robert Marone is going to be on at 3:30 Central Time on our new series called In Profile. So I'm looking forward to that interview. I'd love to have you join me. But otherwise, if you haven't already, like, subscribe, comment. I'd love to hear from you. But otherwise, I will see you guys soon. So thank you so much, and I will talk to you later. Peace.